Welcome everybody to a special live cast today on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. We're going to be discussing the state of monetization in the game industry tonight. What's been going on with such things as Battlefront 2, loot box and gacha design, and a lot more. But joining me tonight is noted game economist Ramin Shokrizade.
Thank you, Josh.
Hey Ramin, it is a pleasure to have you on tonight. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited about this podcast.
Oh, yes. And I see we have a few of my regulars in. Hey, Josh and El Gordo. But this is going to be an interesting one. For those of you who missed the announcement, I spoke with Ramin on a recorded podcast last week. And this is kind of going to be our follow up talk, but the first one for you folks watching. And the best part, with this topic, there's so much to discuss that we can certainly, I'm sure we'll have a part 3 and 4 at some point in the future. But to get things going with, for people who don't know who you are, Ramin, could you, I guess, briefly talk about what your position is in the game industry and kind of your background?
Well, okay. I Prior to entering the gaming industry, I was an exercise physiologist, Olympic women's track coach. I worked for 3 years at the Betty Ford Center, working with drug rehab, and I did neuroscience research studying mechanisms of addiction, which all ended up being useful in gaming. I ended up helping. Um, I was an early competitive gamer and then actually
Mm-hmm.
started making my living playing games in 1999 and got very interested in how this whole uh, sale of virtual goods thing was happening. And I started writing the first articles about that uh, and became a, a fairly active game economist, not game journalist, I'm sorry, in 2001. Um, but by 2005, I could see. Oh, I should back up real quick. In 2000, in 2001, I was helping with a lot of games like Dark Ages of Camelot, um, Shattered Galaxy by Nexon, and and then later games like EVE Online, helping with their game economies. Uh, with Nexon, when I was there, that's when they were just trying to develop the first free-to-play monetization models, and I was there working for Nexon at that time. So I got to be there at ground zero and see how that was all working or
Mm-hmm.
not working. 2005, I decided we needed uh, new economic models and new business models for gaming for the West because I didn't think free to play as it was being deployed in Asia was going to be very good for gamers here in the West.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I ended up going back to school for economics. In 2009, I created a very large 35-page paper explaining how we can make consumer-friendly game economies and business models for the West. Um, and then I ended up being the first game economist for Microsoft, the first game economist for Take-Two Interactive, first game economist for Wargaming. Um, and in 2013, I was chosen by the international regulatory body to be their advisor as they were crafting international regulation to protect children uh, uh, from maybe some aspects of free-to-play gaming.
Mm-hmm. And I know we mentioned this on the podcast we did last week, but the first game that you started to get into, or the one that sort of began this, was Shattered Galaxy. I think that was, you said 98 or 99. Again, it feels like it's been like a lifetime ago. But that was
Oh,
the
well,
first
I
game
was
that I
making
got to
I
play.
I was making money with
Oh, yeah, EverQuest.
EverQuest,
Mm-hmm.
and I was shocked the first time somebody offered me hundreds of dollars for a character, and then I got smart and I instead of selling characters, I started using the characters to get items and then sell the items because then I could just keep selling it. It was a lot. It was a more sustainable.
Oh, yeah. And there's certainly a lot to discuss. And we weren't originally going to do this live cast so soon, but the news this week has certainly been very interesting with Battlefront 2 and kind of, I guess, the downward spiral in terms of fan reaction to that game. And we definitely are going to get into that, but I figured the first thing I want to do is get to, I think, one of our meatier discussions, and that is about loot box and gotcha design. So I guess our first question, this is one that I'm sure we either have a very long or very short answer for you, Ramin, but it's one a lot of people have been arguing. Are loot boxes a form of gambling?
Yes.
And that's our podcast, folks. That's it. We're done for tonight.
Thanks, Josh.
That's it. We settled it right there. But that has been a discussion that we have seen many times over. Again, Rami and I both post pretty frequently on Gama Sutra, and we've certainly seen people argue about it there. So I want to. Obviously, we just leave it like that. This podcast will be very short, but let's get into a little bit more detail. So, I want to bring up a few of the defenses that people use about loot boxes. I want to kind of get your thoughts on them, Ramin. So, the first one that we hear a lot of, and this is one that just drives me nuts, is when people try to equate loot boxes to playing games in the arcade or getting items in like an ARPG or stuff along those lines, where they equate it to I'm giving the game money, or I'm rolling the dice for a random chance, so it must be the same, right?
Well, I mean, when you're purchasing a loot
Mm-hmm.
box, you're making a transaction. You're paying
Mm-hmm.
for something without even knowing what you're getting. And the fact that you don't know what you're getting creates a certain amount of chemical anticipation. You start
Mm-hmm.
to release dopamine before you even open the box. And this is the same physiological response that makes gambling both effective and problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the knowledge that this is going on inside your body and inside your brain is why this technique is used because it is effective. It
Mm-hmm.
does take advantage of weaknesses in the human physiology and can cause an increase in sales.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, the fact that it is a random chance also is one major reasons why it's become so popular among free to play and, as we've seen over the last few weeks, AAA development as well, by the fact that it allows you to greatly extend the amount of microtransactions that someone needs to buy. And when your game is built, or when your gameplay is built on that progression model, it makes it, of course, a lot harder for someone to actually level up or progress, unless, of course, they spend more money. But as we talked about on our last podcast, you're not really buying anything of actual value. In the sense that if I spend $100 on loot boxes, all I'm doing is just moving the needle forward. Someone else is going to buy even more loot boxes, or as long as they can keep scaling up, you're never reaching a point where you can say, I have bought something that is changing how I'm playing this game.
Well, when you say that we're not selling anything of tangible value,
Mm-hmm.
we're an entertainment provider.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is we're stimulating certain physiological systems in the body that are pleasurable to the user.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really I mean, I make this analogy to 50 years earlier
Mm-hmm.
being very similar to the tobacco companies, which do the same thing, except for they would make you'd have to smoke a cigarette to get this effect.
Mm-hmm.
Now with games, you don't even have to put anything in your body. You just can be exposed to these strong physiological triggers like these random loot generators, and
Mm-hmm.
then you get a release of dopamine, which is the same chemical you will get uh, secondarily to consuming nicotine
Mm-hmm.
when you smoke a cigarette, and it's the same effect. So really, we're a reward chemical supplier, and that's just what the tobacco industry was and
Mm-hmm.
still is.
Yeah.
So if you look at this as to what exactly the service it is we are providing to customers, we're providing this chemical release. So when you say we used to talk about it being a tangible thing, well, yeah, a chemical release isn't tangible, but it certainly is valuable, and that's what keeps customers coming back over and over again for our games. So the more chemical we can release, the
Mm-hmm.
the more effective our games are. In 50 years ago, the tobacco industry was revolutionized by the realization that you could freebase bound nicotine with urea, and this boosted the availability of nicotine in the bloodstream 100-fold. And all of a sudden, uh, interest in cigarettes just skyrocketed, especially among children.
Mm-hmm.
And then it became very difficult for people to stop smoking. And well, we're trying to do the exact same thing in industry. We're trying to find uh, ways to make the physiological hit for
Mm-hmm.
the consumer stronger, so that they will not only be more interested in our products, but they'll also spend more, and they'll have a harder time to stop spending.
Mm-hmm. Now, a quick question from chat. Have there been any notable studies regarding the chemical reactions when you open up loot boxes and that comparison to the gambling industry?
I think I can't cite the specific industry right here. I'm sorry, the specific research right here over the air,
Mm-hmm.
but this is something I began writing about years ago, but it's become basically a standard and an accepted thing in the industry. Whether it's like absolutely true on the level of it's been studied how much dopamine will be released when you're staring at a loot box when you open it. I'm not sure that that study's been done, but everyone in the industry is assuming that that's how it works.
Mm. Yeah. And as you said, Ramin, that we have seen, I know we talked about this last week as well, that a lot of free to play and mobile design have been built around the analytics of how much to push someone before you show a loot box, or how often do you pop up the advertisements and the sales. And I believe in one of your papers or one of your discussions you mentioned that for most people there's usually like an 18-day window that determines whether or not they will then kind of become hooked to then continue buying and supporting that kind of design in a game.
You mean, I think my Whales Don't Swim in the Desert paper, where I
Yeah.
talk about how uh, the typical whale goes 18 days before they make their first purchase.
Mm-hmm.
So these when you're trying to go for the quick sale, like in the first 4 minutes, you may think you're doing well for your product, but you're not actually attracting the whales. The whales are the ones where they're going to say, okay, I've been playing for 18 days,
Mm-hmm.
or give or take a few days there, and I'm seeing value enough that I'm still interested in this game. So chances are I'm going to continue playing past 18 days, and I'm ready to invest in it.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, they may have done those 18 days during a beta or something and then been ready to spend as soon as the game went live.
Mm-hmm. Now, getting back to loot boxes, I guess more in general, I want to get your opinion on the other popular defense. I know this is one that you wrote about on Gamma Sutra. I think I want to say last month, but that is the fact that every loot box or the majority of loot box systems or gotchas that we've seen lately allow you to give you something when you spend that purchase, and then it's either an item that you can use directly or you can mill it or trade in for resources or stuff along those lines. And this goes back to the ESRB distinction that they felt that it wasn't gambling because you're still getting something from that purchase. But obviously, as I'm sure you're about to say, we both don't agree with that statement.
Well, I mean, you are getting something, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not what came out of the box. It's what went into your bloodstream.
Mm-hmm.
So really, the whole argument is deceptive. But even if we were going to pretend that to go along on this whole logic path, if I was to go into a casino and and I had a new special breed of slot machine where when I pulled that lever, every time I pulled the lever, I'd get at least 1 penny back.
Mm-hmm.
If the argument is it's not gambling if you always get something, well, then that machine is no longer a gambling machine
Mm-hmm.
according to that definition. But anyone's going to say that's ludicrous, because whether you get a penny back or not doesn't affect whether it's a gambling machine. It's really a completely irrelevant argument. It's just a red herring to try to, I don't know, make you believe something that isn't true.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And as we talked about last time, if you can buy 100 different loot boxes, but it doesn't. But you'll always hit that point in any of these games where the vast majority of those purchases aren't going to be giving you anything that can actually move you forward. I mentioned stuff like some few of the gotcha games I've played where I have all 5-star characters, which sounds really good, but now I need 6-star, and now eventually going to need 7-star. And of course, the requirements for each one of those classes goes up exponentially. And if I spend money on a loot box and I get like 2 or 3-star, or even if I get a 5-star character, at the point where I'm at in the game, I'm just basically throwing my money away.
Well, this goes back to the infinite value game
Mm-hmm.
con, which is a trick to trick the brain, thinking that if we punish or make the game uncomfortable enough for the user, they will think that there will be value in
Mm-hmm.
having more power or having more utility, and we will then sell them the cure for the discomfort we just put them in.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, as soon as we sell them the upgrade, then the game adjusts and becomes harder, and then they're back where they started again. So
Yeah.
this is an infinite loop where we can keep discomforting the consumer and then selling them the solution to discomfort we just inflicted them with, and then have them, the whole cycle go over and over again. And
Mm-hmm.
and 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 there's only a very small percentage of the population, a very small percentage of the adult population that is vulnerable to this con. And those people are highly sought after by gaming companies. When we get into children, because their brains aren't fully developed, they're much more vulnerable to this con, and that makes them the ideal consumer for most of these products.
Mm-hmm. And when we talked last week, we mentioned about how a lot of the design and UI considerations for these free to play and mobile games are aimed explicitly at children for that very same reason.
Well, we went through this with the tobacco industry.
Mm-hmm.
In 1988, uh, clever marketers decided to use Comic Sans to create a cartoon version of the camel on the Camel cigarette boxes, and we got Joe Camel. And it was determined, and this went on for years, the congressional testimony and such. It was determined that these products were not just implicitly but explicitly targeted towards children, and they were very effective. And as the internal documents showed for the tobacco companies, that today's children smokers are tomorrow's adult smokers. Same thing with games. Today's
Mm-hmm.
children gamers are tomorrow's adult gamers. So getting them early is important. So if you use Comic Sans, that's an immediate signal to a child that this game is made for them. So they know, oh, that one's for me. I want to play that, even though they know nothing about the game at all.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And another big point about the loot box I want to bring up with you, Rami, and this is another one that was argued with the ESRB and especially defenders of loot box and gotcha design. I think this will also kind of lead into discussing more what's going on with Battlefront 2. And that is the fact that the games that we're discussing and where this argument of gambling come into, a lot of them do feature some element of skill based rewards or skill based mastery, be it in the form of playing a first person shooter like Call of Duty or understanding how to build like your deck in a game like Hearthstone or any number of free to play RPG games. So the argument that they feel is that because the game itself has gameplay mastery or depth to it, that the loot boxes don't factor into gambling because gambling for in terms of the popular definition is that the gambler themselves has no real control over the outcome.
Again, it's a red herring.
Yeah.
The game, is what we call it, is a chemical delivery device, and 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 if you perceive the game as skill based, you will get a much bigger hit. Let me give you an example. If I put you on a track, I talk about track because I used to be a track coach. If I put you on a track and I have two Olympic athletes next to you on the line, and the gun goes off, and you're running as hard as you can, and amazingly, you win the race. You're like, oh my God, I just beat two Olympic athletes. I'm amazing. And you'll get this huge dopamine hit because you just done something like totally impossible. Uh, but the problem is that really was impossible. I mean, most people will realize that the two guys or gals you were
Hmm.
running against uh, let you win, but there's a small percentage of population, adult population, that won't realize this right away,
Hmm.
and you can keep running this con with them over and over again, where they think they won because they were better,
Hmm.
but it doesn't matter. What matters is how much chemical you got at the end, and if it looked like the event was skill based, you get more chemical.
Hmm. And we've certainly seen a lot of those little tricks used in multiplayer games. The ever popular matchmaking system that can just so happen to match you with someone who may have a weaker set of cards or a weaker character than you, and then we can hit you with something later on by putting you in the real version of that matchmaking, or put you as the weaker against someone else and let them feel better. Or as we saw very recently with the Activision patent with having multiplayer matchmaking explicitly designed to match people with those who've spent money to try and make you feel like you're inadequate or you need to spend money in order to catch up to them.
Well, as humans, we're
Mm.
much more sensitive to contrast than we
Mm-hmm.
are to just an absolute
Yeah.
sensory input. So if the lights get brighter, at first it feels really bright, and then we adapt to it, and it feels normal. If a sound gets louder, at first it seems loud, but then we adapt, and it just seems normal to us. If 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 a game just feels the same, uh,
Mm-hmm.
match after match, then it's going to get boring. So we oscillate it. We'll intentionally make matches easier or harder, and that way you keep producing chemical. Because if you stop producing chemical because it feels like it's too predictable, then you're going to churn out, and we lose you as a customer.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and just trying to keep the player from seeing the quote unquote man behind the curtain is a major part of these various tactics. Because as long as you, as you said, Rami, as long as the player still thinks that they are the ones in control, they're going to keep jumping through the hoops, buying these loot boxes, and feeling like they're making progress. When in fact, it's pretty much the game that's dictating any kind of progression or power scaling. You mentioned if
Well,
you. Oh, go ahead.
just real quick, when we want to be mean to a player
Mm-hmm.
to put them under stress, we don't do it ourselves because that would make us look bad. So we will sick another player
Oh,
on them,
yes.
and then make them mad at the other player, so they'll blame the player for what we just
Mm-hmm.
did to them. But that wasn't accidental, what just happened to them. We're playing them, but
Yeah.
they're blaming the wrong person, which is exactly what we want. Because
Mm-hmm.
if they blamed us, like what just happened with Battlefront 2, then we're in serious trouble. I mean, they had to shut down all their microtransactions because they got caught.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And going back to what you said a few minutes ago with the running the doing a race, that kind of analogy, we can see this in so many free to play games. I mean, for those of you watching this live or recorded, raise your hand if when the first loot box you open up in any free to play game, it just so happens to have an epic or a legendary character in it because it's trying to say, hey, oh my god, you just got this amazing card. What could be in the next one? And we mentioned that on our previous podcast as well, with trying to convince you of these patterns that if I open this loot box and there's something amazing in it, then the next one must have something, or the next one, and so on.
Well, this is a human brain operates on
Mm-hmm.
inductive reasoning.
Yeah.
If if I uh, if I go through 100 green lights and it's always safe for me, then I'm going to assume the 101th
Mm-hmm.
green light is also going to be safe. So instead of just stopping every time I get to green light and looking both ways, which in itself could be dangerous, I just trust that I'm going to be just as safe on the next travel through the intersection as I was on the previous intersection. And for people who have had enough positive experiences, they're going to continue to assume the next one is also a
Hmm.
positive experience. So this will happen with a box. If I if I see, oh wow, look how much value I got on the last box, inductive reasoning will tell me, oh, I'm likely to get just as much value on the next box, even though it's not true because it was they were just playing you.
Hmm. Yep. Now, before we talk a little bit more about Battlefront 2, there's one bit of a discussion regarding loot boxes slash gotcha that I want to ask you about, Ramin. And this is something that came up during our live cast we just did last night on the channel. And that is the fact that loot boxes, by their nature, are not designed around a fixed number of items. As in, when when we buy a loot box and we get the items, we can have just the same amount of chance of getting duplicates as we can with trying to get something else new, or at least in terms of rarity. As we all know, when it comes to loot boxes or the ones that reveal it, higher quality items, of course, have a low percent chance of dropping. But there's been discussions regarding if should loot boxes um, have a fixed number of items, as in if I open a loot box and I get item A, that item will never appear in a subsequent loot box opening. And I know there are a lot of developers who are vehemently against it for obvious reasons. But I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on that kind of redesign? Would that help in any way, or are we just, just shifting sands around or shifting sand around?
Well, there's been some talk that Blizzard already does this, where if you've gotten a card, you're less likely to get that card again. So they're trying to manipulate that. Some would argue that they're doing that to be player friendly. I would argue that they're doing that to reduce churn.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, because I don't think I mean they're just two flip sides of the coin. But the
Mm-hmm.
developer isn't thinking if they're using these types of mechanics in the first place, their goal isn't to make their game player friendly. Their game is to make it effectively manipulate the user into spending.
Mm-hmm.
And now, if you're perceiving it as
Yeah,
friendly, then it's being effective.
of course. And speaking about Blizzard, that actually reminds me of the ever popular argument for loot boxes. I know this is another one that you've spoken about as well in the past, and that is the discussion of if a loot box just has cosmetic items or no gameplay impacting effect, then it's not considered gambling, or it shouldn't be put into the same group as games like South Park Phone Destroyer or Battlefront 2 and so on.
Uh, A cosmetic reward is no more tangible than a
Mm-hmm.
non-cosmetic virtual item.
Mm-hmm.
They both don't exist. What does exist is the chemical you get when you think about opening the box and when you do open the box.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're selling. We're not selling virtual goods. We're selling chemical pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And as we've said already, once you get someone hooked like that, or that small population of whales, that has become such a major focus, despite the fact that it can really do harm towards the game, and especially towards the perception of the game. Now, we haven't spoken about this yet. This will be a later discussion for this evening regarding pay to win and free to play design. But the big example of when things break down, of course, is with Battlefront 2. We've talked about it in passing, I guess, these last few minutes, but I definitely want to spend at least a little bit more time on, especially having you on, Ramin, with your experience with microtransactions and monetization systems. So I was just wondering when news started to break, or like when we first started to hear about this kind of star card system and this kind of monetization, did the red flags go off in your head?
Well, I mean, these red flags moving off for
Mm-hmm.
me, I think quite a number of years before they were for other people because I came from a background in physiology. I came from a background in addiction research. I came from a background in addiction rehab. I mean, I spent a very large part of my life just studying addiction mechanisms, all the way from the molecular level all the way up to the clinical level. So for me, I'm constantly looking at this through this lens. So when I see these mechanics, I'm saying, oh, okay, I see exactly what they're doing. It's not I'm not seeing what I'm supposed to be seeing. I'm seeing what's actually going on.
Hmm.
So I'm catching it right away, and this gives me a little bit of an advantage. And since I'm actually interested in public health, I didn't go into addiction research in order to create an army of thralls that would serve me. I went into addiction research because I didn't think people should be addicted. I wanted to be able to help them. I worked at Betty Ford Center not to abuse people, but to help people. So I have the same approach when I come to gaming, which makes me potentially a non-hire for many of these companies because I'm actually trying to improve life for the consumer, and that's not really the primary goal. Um, but it doesn't have to be a conflict between A and B here. You can actually, I think, my opinion, you actually make more money by better serving the consumer and creating less grief for them. They'll be happier consumers and they'll be longer lasting consumers. So you can see
Hmm.
with the very successful games that I've created, uh, they monetize better every year instead of less better every year because
Hmm.
the players are their needs are being met, they're not being tricked, and they're not being stressed. And for them, it's becoming their entertainment of choice, or you could say their chemical pleasure of choice. And so they become comfortable with it, and they're happy to continue spending because their needs are being met.
Hmm. And we are certainly going to be talking more about how you design these monetization systems for that long term in our next section for sure. Now, with something like Battlefront 2, like I may not have your background, but as someone who has had a chance to study many different game designs, I also had that same feeling the second when I started to hear about this whole star card system and we're going to power up players, that it just started to ring those bells in my head that this is going to be exploited. And we, over the last few weeks, with people data mining the game and, of course, the net reception this week, those feelings were confirmed. Now, of course, as we're sitting here talking this Friday afternoon, EA announced last night that they were turning off the microtransactions. And I've seen some people say, oh, this is a sign that things are going to be improved. But I don't feel that way. I think this is just a band aid fix. And I'm something tells me you're probably thinking the same way about that.
I would think that this is the absolute worst case type of damage
Yeah.
control when you decided that something is just so foobar that you have to turn it off on the day that you turn it on.
Hmm. And also, I think cuts into one of the major defense that we see as well from a lot of developers who talk about loot boxes and this kind of monetization by saying that it's an integral part of the game experience. But you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot by then turning around and saying, "Oh, but we can just turn it off and on like will, or turn it on and off at will."
Well, if the primary place that you're giving pleasure is at the loot box and not at the rest of the game, then
Hmm.
really you just created a slot machine.
Yeah, exactly. And that actually takes me to another really big discussion, a really big argument that we see a lot of people have about loot box and monetization design. And I'm sure you have some very interesting thoughts on this, Rami, but when we see developers talk about integrating loot boxes or monetization in their games, this happened, I know we spoke about this last week with Shadow of War. The developer will say something along the lines of, our game wasn't designed around loot boxes, or we balanced the game without them. And I think for me, that just sounds like a complete lie. And I'm just curious, I think this is another one where I think we both share similar thoughts.
Well, I mean, you just have to look at the game and decide
Mm-hmm.
is how much of the game revolves around the loot box and how much of it doesn't. Does it even have a loot box? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the games that I've designed that are most successful, they have no loot boxes.
Mm-hmm.
They have there is no randomly generated reward. The
Mm-hmm.
reward is the randomness comes in being pitted against other players who such that the outcome of the event is going to be unpredictable. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where the lack of prediction comes in, and that's what keeps the game exciting because you don't know whether you're
Mm-hmm.
going to win or lose every time.
Yep. A quick question for you from chat. I know there was an announcement regarding a Belgian investigation on loot boxes. I think it had to do with both Battlefront and Overwatch, although I may be misremembering that. And the question is, do you think that this will lead towards anything regarding defining loot boxes as gambling?
Well, I was summoned to the ICPEN, International Consumer Protection and Enforcement Network Summit in 2013, which is when 70 advanced countries were trying to determine how to regulate
Mm-hmm.
uh, gaming products, especially in regards to sale to children. And this is 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was called because I was the only source of how this was all working in the industry, because for everyone else it was something that if they talked about it they would be fired.
Mm-hmm.
um, so um, the Europe has been very interested in the subject for even years before that summit was held in 2013,
Mm-hmm.
and I was very clear about what they were up against in 2013, so they had a head start. They know what's going on. I mean, they may not know at the level I know, but they know enough that they know they should be concerned about whether these products um, are safe for consumers, and particularly child
Mm-hmm.
consumers. So Belgium is just one of many European countries. If you're hearing noises coming out of Belgium, it's just months before you're going to hear noises coming out of the entire European Union.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're investigating this, that means that they're not just going to do what America is doing, or they're not going to do necessarily what China is doing, or what necessarily what Korea or Japan is doing. They're going to try to find the best solution to a perceived problem that works for their citizens.
Mm-hmm. And this is another major point regarding loot boxes and this kind of discussion on gambling. But another big topic we've been hearing more and more about is regulations, or having a regulatory committee come in and basically establish some hard rules regarding this kind of system and what it means for the impact on the consumer. And as we spoke last week, when it comes to outside companies or outside companies looking at the game industry, I know a lot of developers are strongly against that. But I know we brought this up last week, but for people watching, do you feel that we are going to be seeing some kind of push towards regulations in the coming months?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes, but the long answer is when we had the ICPN summit in 2013, uh, China and United States are both members of the ICPN,
Mm-hmm.
but they were conspicuously absent at that summit. And I would argue the reason they were absent is because the USA and China are two of the world's, if not the two biggest in the world, producers of computer games. So there's going to be intense industry pressure for them not to regulate. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
fact that China is regulating anyways just shows just how serious a problem it's perceived to be in China. There's a tremendous amount of misinformation flooding um, all news sources regarding games right now. I mean, I'm even seeing news sites like the Los Angeles Times, which I read regularly, which is not a gaming news site, printing stuff that I think is just completely not true about computer games, and I had to comment on that when that article posted recently. Uh, we're being flooded right now by a huge mass media campaign to try to um, reestablish that what the industry is doing, the path that they have chosen, almost universally, is good for consumers, or at least not harmful for consumers. And I disagree. And I think I
Mm-hmm.
have enough evidence to show that I disagree. And I provided that evidence in 2013 to the ICPN, and it was convincing. So they
Mm-hmm.
they started going down the path of regulation. It was so convincing that the vice president of Disney had to flee the conference once the German regulators started answering her questions that made her particularly uncomfortable that she didn't think it was a good idea to answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for people watching these, they're live recorded. What Ramin was talking about regarding China having regulations, in case you don't know what we're talking about, is that in China now it is legally mandated that you must provide the percentage chances for the drop rates for loot boxes. So you'll see this in some games over here where it will say chance for a 4 star, 20%. Chance for a 5 star, sometimes like 1.03 or something along those lines.
Well, even that can be deceptive
Yeah.
because there are some cards that are just XP boosters for other cards,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, there are some cards that are they're marked 4 star, but what they are is they're 4 star XP cards. The only purpose is to burn them to add
Yeah.
XP to another card, but they're still 4 star.
They're still.
They still might be epic. They still
Yeah.
might be part of that 18% that Blizzard's claiming is in their epic loot drop chance, but they're not telling you what is an epic. They're not telling you what the individual chances are for the cards. So as far as I'm concerned, they are in non-compliance. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm just looking at it and it's not
Mm-hmm.
following the intent. And it's not, and the intent is to allow consumers to see what they're getting for their money
Mm-hmm.
so that they can make uh, an appropriate decision as to whether they're going to get the value they're seeking or not for their purchase. And by hiding that, um, I think it's antagonistic towards the consumer. It's
Mm-hmm.
making the consumer the enemy. It's making it clear that we're trying to trick the consumer, not serve the consumer.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you just brought up about the fact that this was done to empower the consumer to make these rational thought or rational choices when it comes to loot box purchases. Because, as you just said, the very reason why a lot of companies don't want to do that is for that very same reason. For instance, earlier in 2017, I tried the free-to-play game Fire Emblem. I think I want to say Heroes. That's the gacha one. And the very first thing I saw after I was done the whole tutorial was, buy a loot box or, summon an orb. And I looked right underneath in that very little text that showed all the drop percent chances for all the items. I just realized it's just the same crap over and over again in these games. And I just uninstalled it. But that's the kind of thing that developers don't really want you to know. Because as we said, once you start looking at how things work behind the scenes, you can start to put together how these systems are essentially designed against the consumer. Or as you said, they're anti-consumer.
Well, it's frustrating for me because I'm an actual game economist. I went to school. I actually created all these methods to create these systems in games. But now what you're seeing companies hiring when they talk about a game economist, what they're really talking about is somebody who can make these gambling mechanisms, which is
Mm-hmm.
really to them gambling is economy, and I don't think it is at all. When I go
Mm-hmm.
out into the real world and I talk to an economist, they're not an expert on gambling.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, People who are experts on gambling are experts on gambling, and it's two totally different things. But
Yeah.
that is that is what they mean when they talk about economy in games now, and it's disturbing to me because it's we have an entire industry that has now moved towards a business model where the whole idea is to exploit
Mm-hmm.
consumers instead of providing value to consumers.
Yeah. And I know when we last spoke, one of the things I think this will probably lead into talking about kind of the games that do it right or design these long term games was a lot of the early MMOs. We, of course, talked about Shattered Galaxy, EverQuest, and the like that were built around these games existing and lasting for long periods of time.
Look
Now,
how long EVE Online's been around.
exactly. And one of the big points, and this is another kind of thing that got twisted as it became more popular, was the idea of long term game development or quote unquote games as a service. And for this next part, I want to talk more about designing a game with that mentality or thinking about a game not just as a one and done release, but something that you intend to work on and support for months, even years on end. So the first question that I have for you, and again, with your background with working with developers and such, when you go in to a company like, I know you mentioned, of course, you worked with a War Tanks developer, wargaming.net. When you're going in and you're looking at these games for long-term viability, what's kind of like your process with picking apart these systems?
Well, I mean, the early game economies where we had, Dark Age of Camelot, Anarchy Online, um, World of Warcraft, EVE Online. I worked with all these economies when they were being developed, and the idea was that here you had an economy that could actually be attacked from outside, and if that happened, your currency would become worthless. So the all my early research was aimed at trying to create an economy that was resistant to attack, so that these economies could last for years or even decades and be continually sustainable, just like a real economy. Maybe even better because our real economies aren't even sustainable. They crash every 10 years. So because we haven't figured out how to make them truly sustainable. So I'm looking at something that is built to last. Whereas when you're trying to trick your consumer, the consumer has the ability to adapt over time, and so the tricks only works for so long, and then the consumer becomes resistant, and this is what you're seeing, for instance, in Battlefront. The type of reaction you saw with 750,000 downvotes on Reddit is what you're seeing is consumer adaptation. The the trick isn't working anymore. uh, I'm proud of consumers that they're becoming sophisticated enough
Mm-hmm.
to be able to identify these things without somebody like me having to point it out.
Yep, and as another interesting point, it was pointed out to me earlier today that on Metacritic, Battlefront 2 stood at, I think, a .08 out of 10 in terms of its score from users. So I was kind of shocked by that one, but
I'm sure they're shocked too. I mean,
yes.
this is a Disney product,
Mm-hmm.
and Disney is probably thinking, wow. I mean, because obviously Disney's heading down this route too, and it was no accident that I showed regulators a Disney product in 2013 to get them scared.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was an example of one of the worst products on the market was a Disney product called Marvel Superhero Squad Online, made by Gazillion, which just coincidentally this week has had their support
Mm-hmm.
pulled by Disney. I think Disney may realize that there is starting to realize that there's actually a downside to this approach,
Yeah.
whereas I didn't. I think they just saw it all as upside before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just got a comment on chat. The Xbox version is sitting at .3 out of 10 for Battlefront 2.
Well,
And
this is a Disney product too, right?
yeah, and as you just said, I mean, that, and I think this also goes back to what we were saying with Battlefront 2, that a lot of these changes, like the big change for turning off the microtransactions, I don't think it came from EA looking at consumer outrage. I think a lot of people also agree that it came from Disney going, why is this product that we have our name attached to sitting at less than 1% on Metacritic right now, or having the most downvoted of any Reddit thread ever made?
Oh, right. Because I mean, I can only imagine how much money they spent to build this game.
Oh,
But
yeah.
now they're just seeing millions or possibly tens of millions of brand value just being flushed down the toilet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they just lost just that whole Reddit whole thing. This release has cost Disney so many millions of dollars
Oh, yeah.
just in brand value that it's catastrophic. That's why they're just pulling the thing and saying, you guys really screwed up. We have to stop and reassess this. Well, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I've been telling Disney that for years, but they wouldn't listen to me because they just saw me as a problem,
Mm-hmm.
that they would rather didn't exist. But the problem wasn't coming from me. I was just pointing the finger at it.
Mm-hmm. And that actually takes me back quickly to Battlefront 2. As we just said, they have turned off the microtransaction systems. But it sounds like it's going to come back on very soon. It's going to come back on in the future. So I'm just really concerned myself with, is this actually going to be a sign that things are moving forward? Or is everybody going to forget about this in 1 to 2 months, and we're going to be right back to where we started?
Well, you're unless they can come up with models that are sexy enough that
Mm-hmm.
they look attractive again to consumers, and that consumers haven't had a chance to adapt to them, then yeah, it'll work. But I'm not seeing that because the
Yeah.
techniques that are being used today, the vast majority of them are just the same techniques that were being developed in Asia back in 2003, 2004. We're just making them a little sexier. We're using a lot more data science to make our numbers more efficient,
Mm-hmm.
uh, to be more reactive to consumers in games, so that when they do something, the next thing the game does is a reaction to what they just did.
Mm-hmm.
This is all products of data science. We're getting very sophisticated about it, uh, but that's not that's that's not really like adding value. What I would say is that all these techniques are methods of value exaggeration, not
Mm-hmm.
value creation,
Yeah, and
and that's our problem.
yeah, and I know you spoke about that. I think either on our podcast last week or on a Gama Sutra post, and how a lot of these games, in terms of making a game that's long term viable versus the short term rush, that a lot of the content or work that goes into them is exaggerating the value proposition. Again, with exploitive loot boxes or pay or wait mechanics or energy, rather than creating a system that is designed to keep someone engaged for weeks and months and years on end.
Well, you can see where the industry is going by
Mm-hmm.
just looking at where they're hiring. If
Yeah.
you look at the job pages, you can see the most in-demand positions are the ones for data scientists, game economists, which are really
Mm-hmm.
closer to gambling scientists
Mm-hmm.
these days, and and there's less and less jobs for creatives, the ones that would be creating the stuff that's interesting, the stuff
Mm-hmm.
that like when I look at the advertisements for Battlefront, all that stuff was made by creatives like artists and stuff. I see Star Wars figures running around and battling, and I get excited
Yeah.
even though I know what's in store for me,
Yeah.
because I'm like, wow, that's really cool. I see those ads and I go, I wish I could play a game like that. I just know that that's
Yeah.
what I'm seeing is an ad for something that isn't that game. What
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing is an ad for something that's, well, just in the latest releases this year for the industry, for their financials, you can see that at this point with AAA, they're now making more than 50% of their income from these microtransactions or
Mm-hmm.
DLCs than they are from the base retail sale of the game. So when you want to buy a game, whatever you see the sticker price on there, the actual price is going to be 230% of whatever you're seeing. And I think that's what people are reacting to. They're saying, well, I just spent $80 on a game, but now I'm going to have to spend that or more in order to play the full game. Uh, because it's just like when you go into the store and you want to buy a half gallon of orange juice, but they've created like a hole in the bottom. So, and you're actually buying 59 ounces of orange juice,
Mm-hmm.
but you're paying the same price as the 64 ounces. That that wasn't value adding. That was
Mm-hmm.
value exaggerating.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing value exaggeration where we're being told it's $80, but the real price is 230% of that on
Oh yeah.
average.
Oh.
And that means these games have gotten pretty expensive.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, we were talking about this on our Discord channel, our private Discord channel on Game Wisdom, that it's no longer about you spending $60 on a retail game or $80 if you get the deluxe edition. You're spending that plus, some unknown amount of money on the microtransactions in order to get you to that point where you can play the game. For some of these titles, it could be about $120, $130. And when we spoke about the mobile market or the free to play, I mean, how many free to play games have a $99, supposed, value purchase for the consumer that they expect you or they expect the whales to buy?
Some of them are going to have a lot more than
Oh yeah.
$99. The really effective ones don't show you those initially. You won't
Mm.
even have access to those until you've proven yourself as a big spender, a whale, or a VIP,
Mm-hmm.
and then you will start to get
Oof.
offers for things that actually have millions of dollars, not $99, but millions of dollars of
Oof.
purported value. But then they'll say, oh, but we're going to discount it over 99%. So we'll
Mm-hmm.
give you $5 million worth of credits for only $5,000. And your brain goes, wow, what a deal. And you're like, I could be a god.
Mm.
And the next thing you know, you could have bought a car, but you bought $5 million worth of
Oof.
virtual nothing.
I just want to say that I have not played any game that's gone. I've never played any game that far to get those purchases, so or get those options. So that is just, I just got
Don't
like a bit of like existential horror over me right
well,
there.
I've had, because of my position in the industry, I have insiders that leak stuff to me all the time. So I know stuff that I'm not allowed to talk about, but I know what everybody's up to. And I wasn't able to actually see exactly how this was playing out until somebody had actually gone out and used like a stolen credit card and actually tested this
Oh.
by spending like $5 million on one of these games, and they were able to see, they actually were printing through your receipts and stuff, so you could see exactly how everything would just keep ramping up. The more they spent, the more
Mm.
they were offered,
Uh,
and the better the discounts got. This is what I call the infinite value game.
mm-hmm.
And if your brain falls for it, then the value just keeps getting better and better, and your brain goes, "Wow, this is just so much value. I can't
Mm-hmm.
not buy this." And for those who are vulnerable, this can I've heard rumors that people spend up to $30 million on some of these games.
Mm. And as we talked about earlier, with that kind of infinite value, all we're doing is just raising or we're just scaling things up. What you're doing minute one is not is the very same thing you're doing at hour 100. But and this goes back to, as you said, as we're programmed or as our brain chemistry works, that we see this scaling as a form of progress. For instance, the idle genre is just basically pure progression, distilled down without any kind of gameplay or depth. But we see it and we see, oh my goodness, I instead of clicking for 500 points, I'm clicking for 5 million. So I've done all this progressing. But no, you really haven't.
Well, as long as it keeps the dopamine flowing,
Mm-hmm.
it works.
Oh
And
yeah.
we know going back to Cow Clicker that it works.
Mm-hmm.
If it could work with Cow Clicker,
Oh
which
yeah.
was designed to be a satire and designed to not work, when the researchers did it and found that it was working anyways, that was sobering. You can't avoid that type of evidence. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I don't know. It's the 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 gameplay experience really doesn't change when you spend
Oh
a
yeah.
million dollars on a game. It's still the same game. But what does change is that if you're grouped, and in these games, you're always grouped, uh, you are going to get the admiration of your peers because if anyone picks on them, you're the 800-pound gorilla
Yeah.
that can come in there and defend them. So now you're not just getting dopamine, you're
Mm-hmm.
getting oxytocin, which is actually a much more powerful reward chemical than dopamine. So, I mean, this is a whole nother discussion that we're probably not ready to have tonight. But there are more than one reward chemical. A cigarette can only give you dopamine, but
Mm-hmm.
there are multiple reward chemicals that we can produce in games, and the
Mm-hmm.
sophisticated designer
Mm-hmm.
knows how to produce all those
Yeah.
chemicals and can make a far superior product that can generate a lot of money. Um, the question is, how do you do that in an ethical fashion?
Oh
Because
yes.
really, once you're starting to hit multiple reward chemicals with the consumer is increasingly losing control over
Mm-hmm.
their own behavior.
Yeah. And you brought up a really good point there, I mean, with the social aspect that gets tied to these games. And this even goes back to our discussion on MMOs. One of the most popular motivators or reasons to play these games is the social aspect. You're building your guild or your crew of people. And as you said, if you bought the supreme package or, the big spender option, and you're now, all, Infinity Star gear on you, people are going to look at it and go, oh my God, this guy has everything. He's great. I want to be his friend, or I want to be around him. And this even goes back to what we saw lately with Call of Duty World War II, with the idea that now the loot boxes rain from the sky, and you can now see what someone else is getting when they open it.
Well, with the whole announcing what someone else will get
Mm-hmm.
is a an Asian thing. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
for many years in the West, we thought that this was something that would not help sales, and we would never let someone else see what someone else is
Mm-hmm.
getting. But in Asia, they would all, and this is going back to what mid 2000s, like
Mm-hmm.
2004, 2005. I was seeing this mechanic where they would broadcast where every time somebody got a big item, because
Mm-hmm.
this is again, it's triggering the inductive reasoning where they go, well, if someone else is getting
Mm-hmm.
this item, then I should be able to get this item too. But some of those people might have even just be fake accounts. It may just be
Yeah.
streaming stuff that's being open that you don't even know who that person is. That person may not be a real person. It's just there to make you think, oh wow, it's just like you're in a casino and you hear the bells going off down the aisle. Someone else wants something. Well, there's a reason that machine has a bell that it rings. It's not just for the person sitting in front of the
Mm-hmm.
slot machine, it's for everyone else
Of
that can
course.
hear it. So, I mean, these are all mechanics that came from the gambling industry and are being translated over to the gaming industry and vice versa. Now you're seeing uh, slot machines where they'll play a video between, every time you win and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So they're pulling in the gaming stuff to give you an additional reward uh, between the pulls. So
Yeah.
they're moving together. If things don't, if consumers and regulators don't stop, pretty soon the line between casino and interactive media gaming is going to blur to the point that they'll just all become the same thing.
Yeah. Speaking about that line between video games and online and casino or gambling, I wanted to ask you something about that. Last year, I heard, like around here in New Jersey, that a company was experimenting with video game gambling machines. I even made a post about it on my site, and I may have linked to it in Gamma Sutra as well. And after that big announcement, I think it was last October, last November, I have not heard anything else since from that company or how it did. I was just wondering, have you heard anything like from your contacts or your own research regarding that kind of development?
Um, you know, I don't know exactly what they're up to,
Mm-hmm.
even though uh, the company I'm working with now has even made some gambling products before
Mm-hmm.
I arrived. And I would say that's because they're putting a lot more work into it.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever these people are going to make is going to be like it's going to take them more than a year to build it. It's going to be much higher quality product. It's going to be uh, instead of it being 90% casino and 10% game, or on the other end being 90% game and 10% casino, what you're
Mm-hmm.
seeing is these companies trying to build something that's 50-50.
Yeah.
And to do that, they're going to have to innovate because
Mm-hmm.
they're building something that's never existed before. Uh, I don't know, if it's going to be how scary or pleasant is it going to be on the other end, but if it provides value to consumers, I think that's great. If it's deceptive and manipulative to consumers and triggers addiction mechanisms that then the consumer can't control because it's so much more powerful, like,
Mm-hmm.
it's like maybe if this is going to be like adding urea to nicotine in a
Mm-hmm.
cigarette to freebase it to make it 100 times more powerful,
Mm-hmm.
then I would think it's worth any amount of money they're spent to build this. Um, but I would be a little worried about the results for consumers.
Yeah. Now, getting back to the discussion regarding designing games around this kind of long-term development, uh, with regards to, I guess, building these games over what you've done in the past, I guess, are there any commonalities or common elements in the games that you've worked on that help them stay viable over the long term?
Um, is this like a secret sauce question, or are you just talking about generalities?
I'd say let's stick with generalities, unless I don't want you to get in any trouble on the live stream here.
Well, I think the most important factor for
Mm-hmm.
longevity for a game is social interaction.
Mm-hmm.
because long after your content is gone, I mean, like look at World of Warcraft. People don't
Mm-hmm.
play World of Warcraft because the content is just as exciting the 500th time as it was
Mm-hmm.
the first time. They're there because they have friends, that they're interacting with their friends, and when you get to the point where you know you will be missed if you do
Mm-hmm.
not log in that day, then you have hit the gold zone
Ah,
for gaming.
yes.
That's the most important measure of success. Will you be missed if you don't log in that day? If the answer is yes, then that game is a winner for both
Oh,
the company and the consumer.
definitely, 100% agree on that one. I mean, I've even though I've never been able to get hooked on an MMO like to that extent or at that extent, I have heard the stories and I have seen people who basically the MMO becomes like their second family essentially. Their guild becomes their closest friends. We've heard more than our fair share of stories of people, falling in love and getting married through World of Warcraft or EverQuest and the like. And as you said, I mean, once that social aspect is built up and you actually have people waiting for you to come on, that game essentially that's it for you. You won't play another game unless your friends play it with you. And I guess a somewhat of example of that for me would be the game Left 4 Dead. I had friends and we played easily over 1,000 hours of that game because we all really enjoyed it. And then when that game died, we moved on to something else. But as you said, the social aspect is such a powerful motivator to get people invested in these games.
Well, I mean, I talked in our last podcast about how the golden age of gaming
Mm-hmm.
was between like 2001 to 2004 is when we really hit our peak, and that's when the games really became the most social.
Yes.
And I mean, for other people, they were just playing these games for fun, and for the people today who are trying to like work on monetization, uh, they're looking at it through a lens that's met all this about number manipulation and how do we trigger these gambling mechanics. But I was working on monetization back in 2001. So when we were during this golden age, I was studying all these social interactions to see how I could use this to make money, because that's how I made money was by selling
Mm-hmm.
virtual goods during this period. And so I I was really trying to understand how the social interaction would
Mm-hmm.
drive sales. But what happened during this period is a company called IGE came in, and we got hit by these
Mm-hmm.
gold farmers, which just wrecked these economies. And because the technology didn't exist to defend these economies, which is what I later ended up developing between 2005 and 2009, that without that defensive technology, these economies would get wrecked and they would get pillaged, and the money would go
Mm-hmm.
to third parties like IGE, these gold farmers. And so industry reacted by killing their own economies and replacing them with self-destroying economies where instead of having a gold farmer coming in and flooding your economy, you would have the developers selling
Mm-hmm.
loot boxes or other things to destroy their own economy. But the net effect was the same either way. You were in both cases, you were destroying your economy would be destroyed within a certain period of time. Uh, Everything would lose its value. And like you said, if you've already hit the loot box 20 times, then the 21st first time is going to be a lot less valuable to you than the first time because you're just
Mm-hmm.
going to get the same type of stuff you already got because you've already destroyed the value of the things that were coming out of that loot box.
Oh yeah. We talked about this last night as well. It's one of the reasons it's that depreciating value of loot boxes because as you said, if they can cycle in duplicates or experience boosters or things that don't directly impact you, it can just lead the more you spend, essentially the less value you're getting. And the perfect example would be something like with Battlefront 2, that the first time I open up a loot box, I'm getting all brand new stuff because I have nothing. But, fast forward 10, 15 hours and we're on loot box, I don't know, 50 or 100, chances are I'm going to get stuff that I already have. And of course, it's going to become more and more narrower to get that same initial value.
Well, these are the types of issues that a
Mm-hmm.
real game economist
Yeah.
addresses. But that's not when we talk about a game economist in the industry now, at least when I talk to studio after studio, this is not what they're perceiving a Game
Mm-hmm.
Economist to be at all. They're perceiving it to be what they saw happening in Asia, where all this this gambling and trickery was being developed. They
Mm-hmm.
adopted because they saw that it worked, because it does work. At least it works until the consumer adapts.
Yeah.
And increasingly the consumers are adapting. And I think what you saw this week with
Mm-hmm.
Battlefront was consumers adapting, and it's catastrophic because the when these games were being developed,
Mm-hmm.
these techniques still worked,
Yeah.
and a lot of money went into on the assumption that all their data told them this is working, so let's
Mm-hmm.
do it. And everything is data driven today. So if data says today that it works, they just assume that it's going to work tomorrow. But they're not
Mm-hmm.
looking at the trend. They're just looking at the data today. So
Yeah.
they're using data without understanding how data works. And so now the trend is that consumers have adapted, and maybe the developers feel betrayed because they thought they were going to get the payday by running this con on consumers, and consumers got smart and said,
Mm-hmm.
no, we're not gonna do this.
Yeah.
And that could be a total loss
Mm-hmm.
for for EA and Disney in this case,
Yeah.
if like you said, a Metacritic that's a value of like that's well below 1%,
Mm-hmm.
that's catastrophic, especially on a product this expensive.
Oh yes. Yeah, I would. I don't think I want to be a fly on the walls at Dice right now after this week when it comes to Battlefront 2. And it's definitely such a, as you said, I mean, that it's definitely good that consumers are getting more educated and understanding how these things work. And it's great that they're able to point things out. Now, getting back to the topic regarding designing games around this kind of long term viability, as you said a few minutes ago, these games, no matter how well you design them, aren't built around infinite content. As you said, the social aspect is a major part of that. But with that said, though, you still need to be coming out with new stuff. There has to be at least like that initial hook. So,
Well, I'm
go
going to
ahead.
disagree a little bit
Okay.
here because yes, you want to put the initial content in there,
Mm-hmm.
but the smartest developers are going to use user-generated content to take it from there,
Mm-hmm.
because the users can generate way more content
Of
than you
course.
can, and they can generate for free or nearly free.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, a lot of the games I've been involved with were about user-generated content. Like Project Spark, one of my the first game I helped Microsoft with, was all
Mm-hmm.
about user-generated content.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and if the users are generating that content for you, even
Mm-hmm.
if you compensating them in some way, it's much cheaper for
Of
you in
course.
the long run. This is why
Mm-hmm.
Facebook works, because
Mm-hmm.
all the content on Facebook, if you don't count the ads, is user-generated.
Mm-hmm.
Same
Yeah.
thing on a dating site. If I want to read a dating, a bunch of profiles of people that I think are hot, that was all generated by users. They put up their pictures.
Yeah.
They wrote interesting things in there. The person hosting the site didn't have to create all that content. So if
Exactly.
you can get a community going where they're able to contribute things, even if it's just
Mm-hmm.
themselves, that's
Yeah.
user generated content.
Of course, and that getting back to Battlefront with these kinds of games, it's why cultivating a multiplayer community is such a vital part of this. Because as you said,
Absolutely,
if there's no one playing your game, if it's a multiplayer game, how is that supposed to go on?
it's
And
not.
exactly, it's not. And we have seen more than our fair share again of games that were built, especially during the MMO crash of the last decade, of trying to build these communities, and it basically enters a downward spiral that the community's not being created, so no one's staying around. So if anyone tries to come in and play, they're not going to find anyone, so they're going to quit. And once you enter that downward spiral, it can mean the end for a game, no matter how great the gameplay is.
Yes. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's just unfortunately, right now you're seeing a lot of the leadership in the
Mm-hmm.
gaming industry are people who don't understand
Mm-hmm.
why use their products.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand what the value is they're contributing to consumers. And because of that, you have a mismatch between what we're selling and what consumers are buying.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we're seeing layoffs. We're being punished for that.
Yeah. And getting back to the user generated content aspect, we have certainly seen that with games like Team Fortress. And even, I actually want to get your thoughts on this, Ramin. What are your impressions on the MMO Second Life? Because that one has been around for a very long time. It's the one that I think is constantly brought up whenever we talk about, the especially the long-term benefits of user-created content. Because there are people who are just creating original pieces of content in that game, and they are actually buying and selling that stuff within their own economy, and even with being able to transfer that to real money.
Well, they've managed to create a relatively sustainable economy with a
Mm-hmm.
few hiccups where they made some mistakes and
Mm-hmm.
currency would start to flow in. But that's the real key, I think, to creating long-term value for consumers and
Mm-hmm.
long-term value in the terms of, LTV as far as income is creating a sustainable
Yeah.
game environment because only under those conditions are you going to get the type of long-term social interconnections that are going to cause people to say that
Mm-hmm.
there is no upper limit to the amount that I will spend on this game because this is actually a better environment for me than real life.
Oh yeah.
This is actually possibly a meritocracy, whereas real life is not a meritocracy. Real life is rigged.
Mm-hmm.
But if they get an environment where they feel like it's a more fair than the real world, then they will invest more in that world than in this world.
Yeah, definitely. And Oscar and Chad brought up a really good question. As we said, when it comes to user generated content, a lot of it, especially for the longest time, has been free. Your Steam workshops, I remember back in the old days, File Planet and the like. But speaking about developers or companies trying to integrate the stuff, we've seen, especially by Bethesda, trying to get paid mods a thing. There is, of course, Bethesda's Creators Club. And even before that, selling mods on the Steam Workshop, which, speaking about another like catastrophic failure, we basically saw it happen on Thursday. I did a podcast about it on Friday, and then by Sunday, Steam already took it down. But what are your thoughts on being able to buy and sell user created content like that?
Well, as somebody who made their living
Mm-hmm.
selling virtual goods inside other games since 1999,
Mm-hmm.
I think I want people to be able to come into my game, the most hardcore users, and feel like if they're going to spend almost their entire waking lives in my game instead of in the real world, then why not make the game world their real world where they can actually live and work in it? And I think eventually that's the way everything's going to be. I think we are going to,
Mm-hmm.
if I wrote an article in 2010 called Third Tier Game Development, where I predict that's how we're going to go to work. If I'm going to work in a hospital, I log in and I do my
Mm-hmm.
hospital job from my computer. If that means if I'm doing a surgery from my house, I'm doing a surgery from my house. I'm operating the machines or the robots from my
Mm-hmm.
computer, and that way I could be in 5 different hospitals in one day instead of having to just
Mm-hmm.
camp in one. It allows my services to be better utilized.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see this entire kind of movement towards the virtual becoming the real. So I think it's important to compensate players. When I made Project Spark,
Mm-hmm.
we set this up so that people could create content that they could share with other people and be compensated for it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not like something you should just roll out of bed and say, "I want to do this." It's a very complicated thing, and if you're going to do it, you should make sure you have qualified people involved in the process.
Mm-hmm. And with that idea of user generated content, I know one of the major discussions or one of the major arguments regarding that is, of course, the ownership of that content. Because we've seen many an argument over if I collaborate with you on a mod and then I go and sell it, do you get part of that profit? And as we said before, money really does change things. And it will be very interesting to see, again, as we said earlier, with the idea of regulations regarding loot box and stuff, what will happen in terms of the future of this kind of paid content. Because I'm sure you probably have examples of this as well, I mean, that we have seen some very amazing work coming from the fans for their favorite games. We've even seen companies being developed thanks to user generated content. For instance, Tripwire with Killing Floor, or oh, I forget their names, but the people who got together who made the Second Wave mod, or I think that was it, or Second Wave or New Wave mod for XCOM and XCOM 2.
What about a mod called Defense of the Ancients?
Of course,
That
yes.
was just put out there for free by fans, and then it was basically uh, gobbed on by a company called Riot that
Hmm.
just changed it a little bit and made it more persistent, and created League of Legends.
Hmm.
And now they're trying to say that that's their intellectual property, and they're trying to sue other companies that are making
Hmm.
other games that look like League of Legends. But League of Legends is at its core was a free mod. It's
Yep.
public source. It's strange to me that they're trying to claim ownership over something that was free,
Yep.
and now it's theirs.
Yep. And in an upcoming podcast, I think that may be going up either next week or the week after, I spoke to a lawyer who specializes with game design and game litigation like that, and we spoke about how you legally cannot copyright game mechanics or systems. Only the layer around that, or the actual tangible brands. So you can copyright, the various champions of League of Legends. But we've seen stuff like this in the past, where someone will say like, "I only copyright for first-person shooters," or "I'm the sole person who can make a platformer," and that is definitely not the case.
I don't know. I have no response to that other than that the whole League of Legends thing is just a microcosm for all that going on, and I think
Mm-hmm.
uh, I think that because people don't know what works, they haven't figured out what consumers want. All they're doing is just copying everyone else. So you're
Mm-hmm.
seeing just just all these copies of the same thing over and over again, and that just lowers the value
Mm-hmm.
of the brand and the idea for everybody, because consumers don't want the same thing over and over again. They want something fresh.
Yeah.
Uh, and of course, they really want social, but that's not being offered to them. So they're
Mm-hmm.
just doing their best with the direct that's being offered to them now,
Mm-hmm.
because the good stuff that was was over 10 years ago. Now we're just getting this junk. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, I have to say that I, as a hardcore gamer, I have a really hard time generating any excitement for the games that have come out in the last 5 years.
Mm. Yeah, and that in of itself, that could probably be a whole an hour and a half discussion we could have right then and there. Getting back to the topic of designing these games around this kind of long-term viability, you just said that it is always about providing the player with new stuff because they will be adapting to it. So, in terms like from like a general design point of view, what kind of content or what kind of purchase options do you find work the best when in terms of keeping the consumer interested and motivated to keep playing your game?
Well, the best systems are the ones
Mm-hmm.
you almost don't see at all, which
Mm-hmm.
is ironic.
Yeah.
But that's why they're not used, is because the data isn't there to show that they're working because they're not existing. And those systems are the anti-narcissistic mechanisms. The mechanisms we see in games now are all narcissism promoting systems. Like, for instance, you want to be better than all your
Mm-hmm.
friends. You want to be the adoration of your friends. Will buy 100 loot boxes, and we'll make you into a god,
Mm-hmm.
and then everyone will adore you. Well, this is promoting narcissism in a few 1 to 2% individuals. Uh, all that you want, all they're trying to get all the power into 1 or 2 people that will keep spending.
Yeah. And
But
then it
and that
becomes oh.
that's narcissism. But what if you flip that upside down and
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to monetize the other 98%? Well, to do that, instead of trying to concentrate the power in one person, you instead sell
Mm-hmm.
gifting. Create a
Mm-hmm.
situation where you're selling something that doesn't help the person buying it, but it helps all their friends.
Mm-hmm.
This means you're not trying to make one person into a god. You're trying to make one person into a community.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely upside down from the way we sell games now, but that's where the money is.
Yeah. Speaking about that building like community around the game, I'm just wondering. I mean, I'm sure you probably heard this, but did you ever play the game? What was it? A Tale in the Desert. I think that's what it was called.
That sounds really familiar.
It was the Egyptian
Oh,
social
yes, yes, yes,
MMO.
yes. Yes, well, I didn't really, I just briefly played it, but I can't really say I did a proper study of it.
Yeah, me neither. I played it for a little bit, but I really
They had
saw.
voting and everything.
Yeah, exactly. And
Mhm.
the economy was basically all self-ran by the people because you were only building craftable goods. So it was about, I build you a pot that can hold stuff. You build me clothing, or you build me something that I can use. And it was such a very different game when I first played. I believe it's still out now. I think they are up to like several different iterations of it. But again, I think it came out during that same period of like 2001, 2004, where it was about the social aspect rather than, again, as you said, the narcissistic side of you're going to be the greatest warrior of the land, or you will be king and everyone will have to adore you, and that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, I was building the economy for a game called Horizons in
Hmm.
2003, which was, as far as to my knowledge, was the first time you someone tried to make a game where everything was player created.
Hmm.
If you wanted to make something, you had to harvest all the resources and then use it to build the next components, and then use those components to build whatever you were eventually going to build. And it was a great exercise. Unfortunately, there were some bugs that crashed the economy. And I actually was
Hmm.
responsible for finding those bugs and sending them to the rest of the team. And then when they weren't fixed, the game predictably crashed, and it was unfortunate.
Hmm.
But it was very educational for me, and I think those types of games are, um, very much the future. I was tapped by uh, Take-Two Interactive and Sid Meier to build the next big massively multiplayer Civilization game, Civilization Online, and this is exactly what I was
Hmm.
doing. I was producing hundreds of pages of models and frameworks for how this could actually be done uh, to build Civilization
Hmm.
Online.
Yeah.
Um, but in the end, um,
Yeah.
I really want to tell you what happened, but I don't think I'm allowed to yet. But I'm a huge Civilization fan, and I want that type of game to be built, and I'm ready to
Yeah.
build it.
Yeah.
Uh, it's just that that's not where the industry is heading right now.
Yeah.
It's
And
where consumers are heading, but
hmm
consumers are heading down one road, and the industry is heading down another road, and that's why we have layoffs.
yeah. And the more and more we're talking, I think I do agree with you that a lot of the MMOs, or the heyday of that kind of design, really did happen in the early thousands when you had these games being built around building these communities up. And the thing about A Tale in the Desert, I can't think of too many other games off the top of my head that were pretty much about letting the player base themselves be in charge of the game in that sense, instead of it being, again, a focus on the power curve, or as Mr. Meepzor said in chat, that you can't have a community game and then in the same breath try and sell progression items or sell power to the players.
Well, yes, because what happens is you reduce the value of every item that you're selling.
Hmm.
When you flood your economy, you devaluate
Yeah.
what's there. You can see Eve's been going on for quite a while, and they've been struggling to try to prop the value of things up there in that world. But that's when you have a game that lasts as long as Eve does, the rules are created by the players themselves. The intrigue, the drama, it's all player created.
Hmm.
I play a game that I'm one of the top players in called Ways of History,
Hmm.
which is for me that's the best massively multiplayer civilization game that's been made to date.
Hmm.
It's not graphically impressive in any way, but they've done an incredible amount of work over the last 8 years building the economy in that game so
Hmm.
that it works, and the competition is great, and people go crazy in that game. People take it very seriously,
Oh yes.
and I love that. I love the community in those types of games, even if it's not always a lot of sometimes a lot of drama in those games.
Yeah, and especially with Eve Online. I mean, we talked about this last week on our podcast, but I remember reading those articles in PC Gamer about these giant, like, corporation, backstabbing and corps like going up against each other. I'm like, Oh my god, what the hell is happening in that game?
I was the richest player in EVE Online for the first, I don't know, 4 or 5 months until I got mad at CCP because of the Miner 2 thing where they were cheating to help some friends in the. It's a long story, and for another podcast. But and in the first few weeks, I had some people came into my corporation and stole everything that was stored in the common, because there was a weakness in the system on how this was secured, that the person was able to come in and just steal all our stuff, and I lost some really valuable blueprints, and because I was actually selling this stuff on eBay, this stuff had real world value to me.
Yeah,
I was robbed. I actually wanted to sue the people that stole this stuff from me. So I was actually trying to get their information from the people in CCP, and they're like, "Well, good luck getting the information. Sicking your lawyers on us all the way over here in Iceland. Good luck with that." And I was really upset because this was actually worth enough money to me that it would have been worth hiring a lawyer to track down who stole my blueprints.
yeah. And that is again like one of those very strange things, and we've spoken about this I think last week, and the discussion about assigning value to these digital goods. And is one of those very strange things because we've seen, as we said before, with the social aspect and even with older MMOs like EverQuest, when the consumer side will assign a real world value to it. But we've also seen developers try and push things or try and force it to happen. For instance, I guess this is something I'm sure you probably wrote about this in the past, Ramin, but the Diablo 3 auction house was
Oh
a
yeah.
major point of contention when it came out. And this again, I think this was like one of like the first, at least from where I was sitting, like one of like the first ripple effects of trying to basically add that monetization to a game that didn't have it. And I remember playing Diablo 3 way back at the original launch, and it was such a different game back then before they changed and they threw it out due to the overwhelming negativity. And I've said this story before, but using the auction house, that's how I basically paid off my Diablo 3 copy, was I just sold items on it and made that money back.
Well, because this is basically what the crux of my research was
Mm-hmm.
understanding all this stuff, and I had actually did all this research for the purposes of going back and helping Blizzard
Mm-hmm.
with World of Warcraft, but that never happened. 4 times I've come into Blizzard to talk about me helping them with their problems, and we've never been able to come to an agreement. Uh, but in the case of Diablo 3, I wrote a paper called Smedley's Dream Part 1 and Part 2, which was a prediction of the Diablo 3 real money auction house. And I wrote that paper without seeing anything
Mm-hmm.
about Diablo 3 other than a hint at what they were going to use for their business model. And I wrote that paper 6 months before anyone got a chance to see the game, before it was released. And it predicted 100% how that was going to go down for Diablo 3, uh,
Mm-hmm.
even to the point of explaining how the game was going to be hacked and everything else.
Oh yes.
And uh, and and the paper was ignored by it. Well, I can't say it was completely ignored because when it turned out to be completely accurate,
Mm-hmm.
the players posted my article on the BattleNet forums, and they had a huge discussion asking why Blizzard hadn't done anything about this information, and of course Blizzard locked and deleted the thread instead of actually taking the advice in the paper. A year later, they did exactly what I recommended, which was to rip the real money auction house out because it was killing their game. But that was an expensive experiment for them, and
Oh
I think
yes.
for them that was like the first miss for a Blizzard product. Because before then they were completely golden.
Oh yeah.
And when you have a miss, that means your brand value goes down. That lowers the value of every product that comes out of your studio after that. So it
Oh.
isn't just that you can't just look at the numbers for that one game and say, "Oh, look, this didn't work out that well." No, you have to look at the damage to your product. Just like Disney and Electronic Arts right now are looking into the
Mm-hmm.
damage of their product with Battlefront. If they think they're losing money now, just wait.
Oh, definitely. And you brought up a really good point there. I mean, that I agree with you completely. That was like the first, I think, real black eye to Blizzard in pretty much like the history of the company. Like again, I've never heard of a Blizzard game do badly or have a negative reaction until Diablo 3 and that whole real money auction house system. And it goes
Well,
back to what we were.
the gold farmers were a problem
Oh yes, and
before going back to World of Warcraft.
yeah, and yeah, World of Warcraft was also the first game to have that kind of, or that was like the first time I heard about like the whole industry behind gold farming was from that World of Warcraft. But I know it's existed in previous cases. I think Diablo 2 even had farmers and loot box or loot bots as well in that game.
Yeah, but see, with Diablo 3,
Hmm.
Blizzard was trying. They wanted to be the
Of
gold
course.
farmers. They were like, instead of having all that money go to a third party, let's cash in on that ourselves. So they
Hmm.
were like, but the problem is with both that approach, what I call in my real money transfer classification paper, what I
Hmm.
the you're trading third party real money transfers for first party real money transfers,
Hmm.
what I call RMT3 versus RMT1. They both destroy your game. The only
Yep.
type of real money transfers you want in your game are RMT2,
Hmm.
which are player driven
Yep.
real money transfers as opposed to like gold farmers. And and RMT2 is basically what you see in Second Life, maybe
Hmm.
somewhat in EVE Online. You're saying it's where you're having the players creating user-generated content and
Hmm.
selling it to other players, uh, not factory farming, but actually adding value to your game. That's the actual only RMT you want in your game. And RMT2 is what was destroyed when companies like Blizzard moved to control that market themselves and cut out the RMT3. So RMT1, the microtransactions we have now, was a reaction to RMT3, which was the gold farmers we had that killed the golden age of gaming.
Hmm.
And we were just we end up killing it ourselves instead of waiting for someone else to kill our games,
You're
which was
you're basically just trading one master for another, or you're trading the wheel is just spinning essentially.
it's just like instead of waiting for the insects to eat our
Hmm.
crops, we're going to drop some pesticides that'll kill our crops and the people eating them.
Hmm. Yep, exactly. And, and it and as we were talking about in chat, like when the developers try to cash in on that, it just hurt the game in the process. I mean, we talked about Battlefront 2 earlier, but
Absolutely.
with Diablo 3, like for like I think wow, I think like the first year, maybe year and a half of that game, it was almost impossible to play that game unless you spent the money or you got stupidly lucky with how the loot was being generated. But again, it's one of those cases where the odds are, of course, effectively stacked against the player, just as they are when we talk about gambling mechanics.
You know, yeah, I would like to, the people who said that I was like, I had a crystal ball and I was
Mm-hmm.
able to like see the future and I had these
Mm-hmm.
special powers of perception. I would love for that to be true. My whole life would be so much better.
Oh yeah.
But no, I don't have extra sensory powers. I can't see into the future. But I'm an economist, and as an
Mm-hmm.
economist, that means I have some ability to see into the future when it comes to economies. And this is where all my research was figuring out how to make games like this better and not make these kinds of mistakes. So when I wrote this paper, I wasn't guessing
Mm-hmm.
as to how that was going to turn out. I knew how that was going to turn out, and that's why it was 100% accurate. It wasn't luck. I mean, I've
Mm-hmm.
done this with so many other situations, like with Zynga. My Zynga analysis paper, same thing. I predicted exactly how it was going down. It wasn't luck. I wasn't magic. It wasn't psychic abilities. It's science. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
science to building games. And when you
Oh yeah.
try to build games without understanding the science to making games, then the result is random, just like from a loot box.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally would not want to make a product and trust a random result as a developer as a company. You don't want to not know how whether you're going to make money or not.
Oh,
That's
definitely.
so
That's a.
so so it's good to actually have science involved. What they're doing now is not really science. It's just the pseudoscience of the psychology trying to trick consumers, and that's that's a cheap that's a cheap imitation of the real science to making games, which is what makes real money. And that's like the products I make that they make more money every year instead of less money without any tricks. No tricks. It's
Yep.
all transparent. No loot boxes.
Oh yeah.
Nothing. It's
Oh.
just quality.
Mhm. Oh, and saying about no loot boxes, I just want to briefly bring that up because another thing that we hear from a lot of defenders, especially developers of loot boxes, is that it's the only way we're making money on our game. And every time I hear that, I just think to myself, if that's the way you're making money, then what kind of product are you actually trying to sell people?
Well, I mean, they are trying to stimulate dopamine,
Yep.
but the problem here is that dopamine is we're wired so that we get less dopamine every time we're exposed
Mm-hmm.
to the same thing. So these things are automatically we're designed to fail in that type of situation where these products are designed to fail because they're going to get less and less useful to the consumer over time. The only products that are going to get more and more useful over time are community building products, and that's not what we're making.
Yeah. Now I'm going to check our time here. I'm afraid. Look, we're already in almost an hour and 40 into our little chat. It feels like it feels like we just started.
I
But
know.
I know we could. And again, if you're free roaming, we can certainly do this again. I'm sure we
Always,
can.
always happy to.
I'm sure we are not going to be running out of topics in the foreseeable future. But for, I guess, our last section, I do want to touch on pay to win versus free to play design because this definitely leads or feeds back into talking about designing ethical monetization and about building long term viability. And do Oscar saying in chat, do a 24-hour podcast. Oh my goodness. I think
A podcast marathon.
there we go. We'll just keep bringing guests. I have thought about that at some point, but it'll probably be the end of me. I think by like hour 18, I think I'll just collapse, and the kids will be like, "Josh, are you okay, Josh? Can someone check on Josh? I think he's collapsed." Oh goodness! But let's see how much we can get into this topic before before at least I start to collapse. I don't know how you're doing, but um, when it comes to free to play and pay to win, this is another
I took a nap before we did this.
that was smart. I've been up all this time, so we'll see what happens. But free to play and pay to win is another major topic, and incidentally, I know as you mentioned that gamers were quoting your article with Diablo 3. I have a post on Game Wisdom about defining pay to win design, and I notice like every few weeks that post will get or that a piece will get posted to some game forum that is doing microtransactions and free to play design. And there's people who argue about it, about what is and what isn't pay to win. So I guess the first question, again, this could probably be an hour right here. For you, Ramin, when you hear the term pay to win, what elements or what microtransactions are considered pay to win in your opinion?
Wow. Okay. Well, anything that is perceived as being directly acquired through money as opposed to being acquired through effort
Mm-hmm.
is going or through merit is going to be considered pay to win. There's a little bit of a gray zone you can tap, which I
Mm-hmm.
do tap, which for instance in my two successful products, World of Tank Splits and World of Warships, where you can make them earn it, but give them a little extra if they're a subscriber. Uh, and that's a mechanic used in World of Tanks, World of Tank Splits, World of Warships very successfully, where if you're a subscriber, you get 50% extra reward at the end
Mm-hmm.
of a battle. But you earned that, so it's not
Mm-hmm.
considered pay to win because in your mind you had to earn that. You didn't just it wasn't just given to you. But if
Mm-hmm.
it came out of a box and there was no effort involved, then that's completely straight up pay to win.
Yeah. And I think I would agree with that. I think for me, when I wrote my piece about it, I said that if you're able to buy any kind of game changing effects or game impacting options that you cannot acquire through merit or skill, that's what I felt was was that distinction between free to play and pay to
Okay,
win.
okay, but it doesn't matter
Mm-hmm.
whether if it can be earned on the side, on the sly, without spending money. Because the point
Yeah.
is all these things we're talking about are virtual goods, and
Mm-hmm.
a virtual good has only has value if it's rare
Yeah.
or scarce. If
Mm-hmm.
once it becomes common, it has no value. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and this is why when the gold farmers came in with RMT3 and started flooding the economy, they were destroying the economies of these games, just like Germany would have destroyed England in World War II with their counterfeiting project if it had been allowed to run much longer,
Mm-hmm.
because they were actually turning the value of the British pound to zero with this counterfeiting. If they had been able to go on long enough, then it would have become worthless, and then they wouldn't be able to buy tanks or anything else. And this would have destroyed England and taken them out of the war. It would have been more powerful than a nuclear weapon, this counterfeiting program that the Germans had developed. And this is basically what the gold farmers were doing. They were
Mm-hmm.
counterfeiting virtual goods and flooding the market to the point where it was also destroying the gold farmers, because even the stuff they were selling was rapidly going to zero, and they knew they would only have a few months to make money off this game, and then they would destroy that game and move on to the next field like a like a swarm of
Mm-hmm.
locusts, and just go from game to game and destroy them until there were no more games. And
Yeah.
that was the end of the golden age of gaming.
Mm-hmm. Now, talking about being able to acquire these items through merit, this is another one of those major points that we can argue about, or that we've seen discussions on. That, and the same thing with Battlefront 2, that you can certainly spend real money and get these items, or you can play and earn enough in-game currency. But the distinction, though, is that to play these games, I know Oscar pointed this out to me a while ago, but or I think it was also brought up that if you wanted to play these games without spending money, it would cost you like 40 hours of playing to even be able to afford this. And I just want to, and you mentioned this a few minutes ago, I mean, that there's always that value proposition between time spent and, of course, money. So, how do you reconcile the two and design something? Oh,
Something that takes 40 hours
mm,
to get
mm-hmm,
has some prestige value with it, because
yeah,
you had to earn that. Something that takes 400 hours to get has even more prestige
mm-hmm,
value. Yeah, something that takes 4,000
yeah,
hours to earn is going to be so valuable that people will really admire you if you have this thing that took 4,000 hours. But the second you can just put it on your credit card and buy
yeah.
it, then then its value just turns to junk, because even if you earned it, the
Everyone
other
else.
players the other players don't know that you earned it. They don't they could it's if you could have bought it, it's assumed you bought it.
Mm-hmm,
So you lose all that 4,000 hours you just spent just became worthless, and that's going to be pretty frustrating for you. And that's what I call equity loss. The value you put in was just vaporized by the developers, and that's going to be very upsetting to you. And people are uh, are more upset if they lose something that they have than if they never had it in the first place. So that's the fastest way to piss off your consumer
oh,
base, is to
yes.
start selling things that people have to work for.
And speaking about, as you said, I mean, with like gold farmers coming and destroying these games, we've also seen over the years of developers who change their economy system or change their monetization to either allow you to buy these things that you used to have to earn, or making it harder to earn things to promote the real money purchases. And as you said, it just pisses people off to say that this thing that I used to be able to work for or get, someone can just buy it in 5-10 seconds, and now they're on the same level as me,
if
essentially.
if people had to spend 40 hours to unlock Darth Vader in
Mm-hmm.
Battlefront, that would not have upset anyone if it wasn't the fact that someone else could just push a button and get Darth Vader.
Mm-hmm.
So that if that was their mistake, and that's why they have 750,000 downvotes on Reddit.
Yep. And as you said, the allure of working yourself towards that. If Dice was making this game as from the consumer point of view first, rather than a microtransaction, they would have never have had a 40-hour grind for Darth Vader. They would have done something more balanced for players. Because is there really 40 hours worth of content or 40 hours worth of progression to get to that point? I'm going to say no in Battlefront 2.
if they had anyone on their team that understood game economics as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to gambling mechanics, then they would have never ever considered doing what they did. But
Mm-hmm.
whoever they had doing that was a gambling expert, not an economics expert.
Yep. And as you said, the second you can purchase it, everyone's going to do it because it's the only way to remain competitively viable. And I remember, I don't think we spoke about this on the last podcast, but I've talked about this before. But the online free to play Battlefield game, I think it was like Battlefield Heroes. And I remember them putting up an article saying, our game was not doing well in terms of people paying, but once we started offering weapons that people could buy, it shocked us how much money we earn. I just sat there thinking, really? You were surprised that when you introduced buying advantages and buying the power curve, that people started doing that.
But it was a temporary spike. It goes
Yes.
up, and then you've destroyed your game, and then it goes way down. So
Mm-hmm.
that ends up creating what'll happen is the people who put that mechanism in will take credit for the spike, but
Mm-hmm.
they'll blame someone else when the game crashes 30 days later. But
Yep.
that's all it'll take. In 30 days, just like with Diablo 3, your game will be dust.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who were taking credit for the spike 30 days earlier are going to be pointing the fingers at everyone else when the 30-day crash comes.
Mm-hmm. And as we spoke about in the previous part, with keeping these games long term, once you start changing things, and as we said earlier, consumers are becoming more aware of these monetization tactics and these ways of basically just trying to ruin your game for short term viability. And once they know about and keeping with this topic of pay to win, once people figure out whether your game is or isn't pay to win, once that brand has been put on your game, it's basically dead from a brand point of view.
It's increasingly becoming this way because consumers are becoming more sophisticated. And they
Yeah.
also kind of act as a hive mind because they talk to each other.
Oh yes. Uh, with that very same thought, I mean, if you pick any free to play game or any game with microtransactions on Steam, it is
Oh,
only a
oh,
ticking clock until someone will make a post saying, "Is this pay to win?" And the community will argue about that.
oh. I mean, usually, and almost anything that's free to play on Steam gets just mercilessly downvoted.
Oh
Um,
yes.
I have to proudly say that World of Warships just launched on Steam yesterday and is getting really great reviews. And because I designed that to not have any pay to win elements, uh, there were very few pay to win elements in World of Tanks Blitz. I tried to remove those, but was not allowed to. But there really are no pay to win elements in World of Warships, and it's getting very high reviews on Steam.
Mm-hmm. And again, like you will have people, oh my goodness, all the games I've seen, even the ones that aren't pay to win, that people will argue saying, and I think that's actually a really good point that I want to
Which
bring up.
games aren't pay to win?
Yeah, it's a very small number of them. But here's the question I want to ask you, Remy. And again, going back to the argument over free to play versus pay to win. Like, there are people out there who will say that anytime you can purchase something in game, that's automatically considered pay to win. Do you? I think you've probably answered this, but is that the case in your opinion that the second you can offer someone to buy something, it's immediately pay to win, or are there other factors?
Well, I mean, if you're buying something that would otherwise be part of your reward system, you've just undermined your reward system.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
you're selling you're you're selling for a quick buck the actual destruction of your reward systems, which are what are actually providing value to your customers, and thus you're destroying your own product. So as soon as you start selling anything that's part of your reward system for the rest of the game, you started the basically the 30-day clock to the end of your product.
So, would you agree that games like Path of Exile that sell cosmetic items or things that aren't that you can't acquire otherwise, would they not be considered pay to win then?
Well, um, it's not pay to win, but it could if those cosmetic items are part of your reward schedule, you're still undermining your reward schedule.
Hmm. But so like if they put something up there that you cannot acquire anywhere in game, you can only spend money to get it, and it's unique like that, would that be considered fair for the consumer then?
Only if those goods are not competing goods for an in-game item that was
Okay.
really hard to acquire. Because even though, yeah, maybe your magic green dragon
Hmm.
cloak is unique, but if there's a magic red dragon cloak that's just like it in the game, and you had to work really hard for that, then you actually can reduce the value of the red dragon cloak, magic cloak, with your green magic dragon cloak.
Yeah, so it's basically saying that this green cloak is a super unique and all powerful item that you must spend 100 hours to get. But this red dragon cloak that has similar abilities, we're just going to charge 10.99, and you can buy it like that.
Well, I mean, Nexon takes claim for having started the whole microtransaction wave with MapleStory in 2001. But I think when I was a game journalist at the time, I think I noted that the first actual pay-to-win microtransaction was in Ultima Online with their first expansion. There was a sword in the
Mm-hmm.
expansion that basically meant you could just beat everyone else in PvP in Ultima Online if you had this sword. And basically, it forced everyone to buy the upgrade if they wanted to play because they had to have this sword or they were now going to get their asses handed to them.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
all.
uh, that was the first example. I documented that as being a really bad precedent for the gaming industry, and it was set by Ultima Online, and I think they did that even before Nexon started the whole pay to win thing with the Maple Story.
Yeah. And as we said earlier, with once something becomes commonplace, it loses all its value or loses a lot of its value. Once everyone saw, like with that sword example in Ultima Online, once everyone bought that expansion, everyone owns that sword, then it loses its value because now everyone is at that same power level.
Right. So then you gotta have another expansion.
And another sword, and another so on. Now, as a quick question, I'm this is actually an interesting point. Mr. Meepzor in chat saying regarding cosmetic items that don't offer an in-game advantage. What about games that allow you to dress up but have a camouflage aspect? Like I know, like PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, for instance. If you're wearing a if you got a piece of, or you got a loot drop of a pink shirt, it's going to make you stick out very much in a community. But let's say I sell cosmetic items that are camouflage or that you could wear that match the surroundings. How would that? I don't know. I think for me, I think that would also be considered giving the player an advantage by spending money.
Yeah, absolutely. But I
Mm-hmm.
still think that either way, anything that sounds like it's cosmetic, if it isn't very clearly something that was extraordinarily hard to earn, is going to be of very little value to the consumer. And I think it's just from a commercial side, is going to be a weak monetization uh, method. I think it
Mm-hmm.
really, if you want to make money in a game, there are ways to make a lot more money than trying to play with that type of stuff.
Yeah.
That's just a very lazy approach to monetization.
Yeah. Now, speaking about that, in terms of providing the player with advantages and trying to balance that, I wanted to ask you something. I mean, regarding again that kind of the free to play versus the pay to win mentality or pay to progress mentality. And speaking about Nexon, did you ever play the game Albatross 18 that they did in the early thousands?
Um, I'm not sure.
It was a
I played so many
I
games
know.
back then, and they
Just
all
like
look
with
the
me with
same.
indie games, I've lost track at this point of all the games that we've had a chance or I've had a chance to play. But Albatross 18 was like an arcade style golf game. Thing like something like Hot Shots Golf that
Okay.
came out during the time.
Yeah, I would say I didn't play that.
All right. In the game, you had the player's skill of being able to, correctly line up your shots, know how much power, gain the timing right. Now, these were obviously player skill elements. But there is also the monetization aspect that in order to get better at the game or to win tournaments, you had to buy better gear, better clubs. They had clothing that gave you boosts. And what happened was you could be the best player. You could know the exact timing for your shots. But if someone who bought, this better club and they could get to the green in 3 shots less than you, it didn't really matter. And there's this argument regarding, I guess, kind of the paywall that a lot of people felt need to be in these games, as in, you could be the best player, but at some point, if you wanted to compete or stand with the other people, you had to spend so and so amount of money or so and so amount of in game resources to basically have that in game abstraction work
Okay,
in your
here's how this
level.
works. Here's how this works, Josh. If there's a best item
Mm-hmm.
that's sold for a reasonable price, like say
Mm-hmm.
$100.
Yeah.
Let's say you want to be a real player, and you want to
Mm-hmm.
be able to compete at the highest echelon, and to do that, you have to spend $100 for some gear.
Yeah.
Then that's a reasonable purchase. And if all the top players have spent $100,
Mm-hmm.
then they're all playing on an equal footing.
Yeah.
That can still be a skill game. That can still be not pay to win.
Yeah.
But as soon as it becomes, well, there's always a bigger thing you can buy, you can always spend
Mm-hmm.
more money, then it's no longer a game of skill. It's a money game.
It's an arms
And
race, essentially.
yeah, it's what I call in one of my early, in my very old paper at this point called How Free to Play Works,
Mm-hmm.
um, is it's what I call an anti-game,
Yeah.
ANTE. It's a game where of like poker, where the people keep anteing up, and the
Mm-hmm.
person who can't match the ante drops out, and the winner just becomes whoever was able to put in the biggest ante.
Yeah.
And so this is what I call an anti-game, and and this is how pay to win fundamentally works, and it becomes has nothing to do with skill. It's just a game of chicken with your wallet,
Mm-hmm.
and the only way to win in an anti-game
Mm-hmm.
is to not play it.
Yeah. And I agree with you on that. I mean, and it's kind of again going back to this difficulty of trying to design an ethical monetization for these games, because as we've seen, people will pony up that money. And as we just said, when it becomes this arms race of I'm going to introduce this item that gives everyone 100 points of damage, but then next month I'm going to put out an item that does 150 points, if the player base becomes susceptible to that or they don't see that kind of monetization, it leads to a lot of money, as we have seen with games like Clash of Clans. And being able to just keep introducing these items and raising the curve up. So the question, and I guess like the big question for tonight is, how do you design things ethically, so that the developer is making money or they're making the money they need to keep going, but the consumer is not being bullied or pressured or tricked into, as we said, like this kind of infinite value of there's always going to be something new to buy or something new to raise that power curve.
Well, I could answer your question, but I don't think I could in the amount of time we have left. But I can definitely tell you that uh, the people who are most vulnerable to these types of tricks are these tricks make you test the value of something in the present versus
Mm-hmm.
the value or value or loss of value, like a cost in the future. And this type of ability to weigh a present time effect versus a future time effect
Yeah.
is handled in the prefrontal cortex of your brain, the very frontmost part of your brain. And it's the last part to develop. It doesn't fully develop on average until you're 25 years old. So that means that these techniques, that only work on a few percent of the population that are really vulnerable to it, those that are most vulnerable are those under the age of 25. And the more you're under the age of 25, okay, I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to say on average because there's some biological variability. There's some people who will never get this,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how old they are.
Yeah.
But generally, if the more you are under 25, the more vulnerable you are to this, which is why children are the most susceptible targets for these types of game
Oh
mechanics,
yes.
which is what worries regulators the most because they're seeing this. I told them about this. I put when in 2013 when I went to the ICPN regulatory summit, I put a picture of the human brain up on the screen and I was explaining how this works. So they get it. They know that these are methods that are used to take advantage of the human organism where it's most weak, when
Mm-hmm.
it's most weak.
Yeah.
If you want to create a system that's ethical, you do it the way other companies do it. You provide value to the consumer and you charge a fair price for that value.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's not what we're doing in the industry now. We're not focusing on creating on value creation. We're focusing on value exaggeration.
Mm-hmm. And as you just said, being able to see the long term results for what you're spending or what you're doing, I mean, that right there is the whole point of gambling addiction. Like, I have my grandmother who tells me, like, she tells us, like, oh, I just won, $300 tonight, I'm up. But she doesn't realize how much money she spent to get that $300. Yeah.
Well, the games are going to get better, and
Mm-hmm.
she's going to lose her money faster pretty soon.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And as you said, when it comes to children playing these free to play or these heavily monetized games, they, as we said, and we said this on our previous chat, that they see, oh my God, I get 5,000 in-game resources for $1.99. That's amazing. I'm going to be so great. But then they don't realize that at some point, 5,000 resources is not going to buy you anything. The and I said this before, I think I said this in a piece, that basically we have the developers or the companies creating their own currency and then dictating what that currency costs.
Yeah, and at least when you're in a casino, you may
Mm-hmm.
have like by law like an 87% payback. But
Mm-hmm.
when you're a game, there's no law. They can be 0% payback. So you're much better off just going to Las Vegas and blowing your money there. It'll last longer.
I may have to disagree with you over. I mean, when I went to Vegas a few times, and I
You
just for
might
the
get
exp-
lucky. You might make money.
No, that doesn't work with me. The My regulars on chat, they know how good my luck is when it comes to probability. No, it's not happening. We've joked before that at some point I'll open up a loot box and there'll just be another loot box in the loot box. That will be the extent of my luck when it comes to these games.
Maybe you should get that new game out on Steam
Yeah,
that's 100% loot box. It's just a loot box opening game.
yeah. I'll still lose that. I'll still won't get anything of value. That is just my luck. Probability and I do not do well together. And it actually, I think, speaks again back to this discussion on ethical monetization or ethical playing or being able to design these games ethically. That someone who doesn't have the luck or someone who is skill oriented should still be able to compete. They should still be able to make progress. But as you said, I mean, if the option is either A, grind for 50 to 100 hours to get to this point, or B, just spend $10, it loses any sense of value in terms of that hard work.
Yeah, that's creates an equity loss. You're
Mm-hmm.
creating a system that destroys your own game.
Exactly. Now, with that said, we have certainly gone over our 2 hours of streaming, and again, we could probably sit here and talk more. But it's going to be time to wrap things up because I can start to feel myself. I'm about to collapse at the keyboard here, but I do have a few more ending questions. Again, my
We know
mouth is starting to die, so.
we know that humans only have about 1 hour and 40 minutes of attention span. Anything after that, they
Mhm.
start to fade on you. So
Yeah,
unless you've got like an epic, third Lord of the Rings movie, it's not a good idea to go significantly over
exactly.
2 hours.
I know. So for you folks watching this live right now, I'm officially putting out last warning or last call for any questions for Ramin regarding monetization, loot boxes, whatever. Because if not, we will be wrapping up in the next few minutes. So I guess here is my capper question, or this is the one that I'm sure people are wondering about, especially developers who may be watching this. and that is, what would you say to people who, when they have to decide to design their game, whether to use these monetization options or to go with something that's more fair to the player? Like when they see like Clash of Clans or Supercell bring in, millions of dollars a day, when they see companies like King and Zynga and the like who have earned more money than we can ever say. But of course, Zynga has, of course, reported massive profit loss over the last few years as well. But when you're trying to convince someone to go the ethical route instead of taking this short term burn, I mean, how do you convince them? I mean, that it is better for the long term to put the consumer first rather than the monetization.
Well, I mean, it's a huge question.
Yes.
Zynga uses Comic Sans.
Yeah.
Supercell uses Comic Sans. Joe Camel uses Comic Sans. It, when there was a class action lawsuit against Apple because they were making it too easy for children to make microtransactions on their platform. After the lawsuit, they made it harder for kids to spend money on these games. And since then, you've seen the numbers for all these Comic Sans games going down. Zynga has been struggling, uh, even though you're seeing Clash Royale do well. Clash of Clans has definitely been dropping off pretty much, and the reasons why Clash Royale is doing well is a whole nother topic that I can't get into. But really, I mean, what you want is a game that provides value to the consumer, and especially if you create the social context so that you're getting expanded value over time instead of decreased value over time, then your game and your company will just prosper. That's how Wargaming.net went from 40 employees to 4,000 employees in just 2 years. And even though they had that whole ruble collapse with the Ukrainian civil war and stuff, they're back and they're doing it better than ever. And the games that were designed that I designed, the World of Tanks Blitz and World of Warships, are now being transferred to every platform they can put it on. It's on Steam. It's mobile or going to mobile. It's on PC. It's going to Xbox. It's going to PlayStation. They're going to put it everywhere because it's a long-term money machine. It doesn't lose value over time. It just keeps getting more valuable. That's what you want for your product. You don't want to have to keep making more content all the time to prop your game up because that's expensive.
Oh, yes. And as we said before, with these social aspects, once you get that community built, and the community is essentially generating the content either directly by creating new goods or indirectly by having people to play against and to meet and to form guilds, it just allows these games to stay on for this long term.
Yeah, and this success I'm describing with the wargaming products comes despite the fact that they're inherently crippled because they're not gender neutral. They're
Mm-hmm.
they're like almost entirely male only focus.
Mm-hmm.
And when you only get one gender playing your game, it has a lot harder time going viral
Mm-hmm.
than if everyone's playing it. And so if you could take the same type of models, which is what I'm trying to do with what I'm building right now, the same type of models, but make them gender neutral, so you're getting both genders playing and maybe playing together, then you're going to have I would predict explosive profits.
Mm-hmm. Here's a quick question from Chad. Mr. Meeps are saying, how do we turn the tide in the boardroom where corporate governance rules decide the course that these game companies will take going forward?
You have a correction where everyone loses their jobs and you start over fresh and you do it smart the next time.
Yeah,
I hate to
and
be I hate to be mean, but
yeah,
as I've predicted, that's what it's going to take because without that, the people at the top aren't going to fire themselves.
yep. And I kind of feel the same way when it comes to like the mobile game scene with so many games again that have gone for the short-term success as opposed to long-term viability. That it is only going to be a matter of time before we're going to see some major companies just dropping out because there's no money in there anymore.
Yeah, and maybe some of these companies are, hear me talking like this, and they see me as the enemy or they see me as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm here trying to save the industry. I'm trying to make
Mm-hmm.
them make more money. And I think it's unfortunate that they just see me as a short-term threat and not a long-term savior because I'm trying to really
Mm-hmm.
make uh, people come back to the gaming industry as consumers and say, wow, this is such an incredible value. I'd much rather spend my money on gaming than on movies or music or dating or sex or any of the other things that are much more expensive but don't give me more value that I'm getting in my game.
Hmm. Now, here's a quick question. Getting back to this idea of ethical monetization, I just thought of something I wanted to ask you. For the games that you've designed, again, like World Warships, World Tanks Blitz. My mouth is starting to die on me as well here. But in these games, do you see like ethical monetization having a fixed number of purchases? As we said earlier with loot boxes and the big discussion there, that loot boxes don't have a fixed limit. They're designed explicitly around you just want to keep buying and buying and buying them and getting duplicates. But for ethical monetization, is that uh, can you do that with having unlimited purchases, or do you think there has to be a fixed number of purchases that you can expect the player to buy?
Wait, you're asking me under what conditions loot boxes would be good?
No, I'm asking in terms of microtransactions and having people buy things in game. Should there be a inherent limit, as in the person should only, if the person wants to, in terms of buying cosmetics or unique items, that there can only be, let's say, 15 purchases and that's it? Or if they go with the endless scale, is that just unethical right there?
This is very murky territory.
Yeah.
If you want to make them earn the chance to do a loot box,
Hmm.
such that the loot box itself becomes part of the reward system, then it works out fine. I mean, if you go to the pre-Diablo 3 Diablo, where
Hmm.
you'd run around and you'd
Yeah.
kill a boss and a loot would fly out, people like that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a random loot generator that excites people. It generates dopamine, which
Hmm.
is part of what people are purchasing when they play a game, and they're not being exploited. They're
Hmm.
not they're not they're not having their own physiology being used against them. They're just having their own physiology being used for them.
And they're being rewarded by playing the game as well.
I mean, that's why they're playing the game,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm. Hmm. But when you, as we said, when you take the player out of the equation and you're saying you must spend money, or the only way you're going to progress is by using these microtransactions or these loot boxes, then you're basically playing against the player, or you're using their physiology against them.
Well, and it's only working against the most vulnerable part of our
Yeah.
population. And in other industries, we don't go around and say, "Oh, let's go after the handicapped person and make that person pay for all the non-handicapped people." I mean, could you imagine it? I mean,
Yeah.
normally when I go to a store, the handicapped spots are in the front. We don't put the handicapped spots on the far end of
Yeah.
the parking lot and charge them $500 for the shuttle to the store and then give free food to everyone else and make the handicapped person pay for everybody's food. That's the total opposite of the
Yeah.
way the whole rest of our society is. But that's not what we're doing in gaming. We're making the most vulnerable people pay for the less vulnerable people, and then the less vulnerable people are bragging about how little they spend in the games.
Hmm.
They think, oh well, I was my will was strong enough. I didn't spend. I'm superior. Well, yes, but you're being subsidized by the people that you're bagging on.
Hmm. Definitely. And as we've said, there have been more than I can't even imagine how many discussions and presentations and seminars on the best way to design your game around whale manipulation.
And that's just like charging the handicapped person to get to your store.
Hmm.
You're you're
Exactly.
you're 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 taking advantage of the weakest people and making them pay for the strongest people. And
Hmm.
that's completely upside down from what would happen in a healthy society.
Yeah.
It's instead of preying on the weak, we should have a system where we're kind of, sharing that workload so that you have a community. And I don't want people to start saying, screaming at me, "Oh my God, he just suggested something like socialism." No, I'm talking about communityism. Create a strong community where everyone works together to be successful. And this is the way our species has been since the dawn of time. We were a tribal species. Our success was everyone else's success, and that's how we are wired chemically also. And the closer you can get to how we're wired for survival, the closer you're going to get to success.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that is definitely a great point to end on. I guess here's my final question. I think this will hopefully be a very quick one. But in terms of like for people watching this, either live or record, who want to check out games that have done it right, you've of course mentioned World Warships, World Tanks Blitz. Are there any other games that you've played or you've worked on that have passed that test of being ethically driven or being pro-consumer when it comes to their design?
Ways of history.
Okay. All right. Let me see.
Um, EVE Online would be able to hit the jackpot if they didn't balance their economy on the backs of new players. It's very veteran friendly and it's newbie harsh. If they could switch that mechanic, and I've offered to help them, but they have not fixed that problem since 2003 when the game came out, and that's what's holding them back. If they could fix that problem, that game would, instead of having a very small, very passionate core user base, they would have a humongous, passionate core user
Yeah.
base.
And that actually takes me to one other point that I just thought of. Again, with this issue, when you're driving your game around monetization, and you're basically just designing around, like the 1% people who are spending, it also can just completely kill a community of people trying to get into the game. Because you'll have someone new show up and realize that that everyone I'm playing against is just outright killing me because there's no community around you. There's basically only the low end and the high end, and no one in between. And there's just no way for someone to get into this game anymore.
When you have a pay-to-win game,
Mm-hmm.
you're selling narcissism,
Yep.
and it's popular with people who like narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
But for all the rest of us, the other 98% that come in, we look at it and go, this game sucks.
Yeah.
I'm out of here.
Yeah. I don't want to play this game where I keep seeing price tags thrown at me and I can't do anything else.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter how much I like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Mariah Carey. Oops, I didn't say it. No. Please don't send your lawyers after me.
Oh, we're in trouble. We better end this now. But yeah, it may be a short-term win, but it will eventually come back and destroy these games.
Yeah, and I love Ozzy too. So don't send your lawyers after me.
All right. Well, I think that is certainly a great point we better end on. Plus, I can feel myself dropping. I made sure to bring multiple drinks this time for this cast, but now I realize in the future I need to have snacks near me as well. I should just have like an entire mini bar set up before we start doing these podcasts, or there is no way I will survive a 24-hour
They get
podcast.
popular enough, and we do decide to do. We get enough people who are going to just keep asking us good questions,
Mm-hmm.
and we decide to do a marathon. We could do it, but I think, I mean, when I'm being interviewed, I have to think a lot harder than I normally do because I don't want to say something
Yeah.
that stupid that will haunt me for the rest of my life. So it's not like just gaming where if I blow a match, I lose and it's not a big deal. When I'm doing an interview, I'm running really hot
Yeah.
because if I say something dumb, that could be the end of my career,
Mm-hmm.
or my friendship with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I got to be a little careful what I say.
Yeah.
So it's probably not a good idea.
Nah. And again, we'll get later, and I'll just collapse at the keyboard, and we'll need to get someone here to come and help me there.
Yeah.
But Ramin, again, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And like I said, if you're free in the future, I mean, there is so much more we can talk about, either live or recorded.
Right. Well, I'm here to help not only the players but also the developers. So if they want to come in here and
Hmm.
start asking me some hard questions on how they can be making better games, then I'm all for that.
Awesome. And yeah, uh, hi, Balak. Thanks for coming on. Yeah, but yeah, we can certainly have you back on again. I mean, like I said, as long as you're interested in talking, I we can certainly chat about who knows, whatever, and more in coming podcasts.
Okay, great.
All right. So, Rami, if you wouldn't mind hanging on Skype for like 1 minute after we cut the stream, I just have a few things to ask you afterwards.
Sure.
But we are going to say goodnight here. So, those of you who've been watching this live or recorded, thank you so much for tuning in. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe. If you would like to support Game Wisdom directly and get access to our private Discord channel, you can find information under patreon.com/gwbicer. $1 or more is all that you need to get into our Discord, as well as voting for more features. For those of you watching this live, I will probably be back on later tonight for a game stream. But again, thank you so much for tuning in. Check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And our first chat between Rami and I will be going up in a few weeks, where we talk more about general monetization and different topics than tonight. So it will be its own talk. Again, Rami, thank you so much for coming on. Are there any websites or any places you would like to promote or mention for people watching who may want to follow you?
Oh, well, I write regularly on Gama Sutra,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a good place. You can find a lot of my articles going back to 2012 when I started posting on Gama Sutra there. I mean, anything that I mentioned or alluded to here, you can also find just by Googling me. A lot of stuff will come up. I've
Mm-hmm.
been writing, supporting industry for a long time now.
Awesome. And like I said, we'll definitely be talking afterwards and privately about having you back on and for more topics. So I'm sure this won't be the last time we'll be talking here on the stream.
Yes, well, it's always a pleasure. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it.
Great. So with that said, thanks again, folks, for tuning in. Be sure to check back tonight for the game stream, and hopefully we'll be able to have more discussions like this in the future. And for anyone watching this who's in the game industry who would like to come on to talk, whether it is about their own game or industry topics in general, please get in touch, as I'm always looking for new people to talk to. So, with that said, thank you so much for coming out to the stream, and for those of you watching this recorded, have a great rest of the night. I need to go get something to eat and refill for more talking, but thanks again, and we'll talk again real soon. Take care.